to another edition of Phil Kaye. Wow. Today I learned that the name of my channel is is my name. It's my Gmail handle essentially, Phil Kaye, unless I give it another name. I'm somewhere between ignorant and lazy, so I'll just leave that alone for now. But the question for today's episode is Veneer, the Book of Math, even a gaming product? So let's consider gaming products of old, or most gaming products really. You have your collections of monsters or villains, and those are typically statted out for you, almost always statted out for you. You have descriptions of places, and those often have very few stats, but if there's a barkeeper mentioned, somebody writes in parentheses that he's a second level fighter with strength 15 and constitution 10 and so on. There are adventures which you think by necessity have a lot of stats, but are the stats really that important? And I'm going to argue that the stats themselves are not that important. First, let me start with an old school product that made a terrible mistake by including stats, and that was deities and demigods. It was the first, as far as I know, the first collection of gods, and it had some magnificent art, especially by Jeff D. The original edition had Cthulhu and Elric, and I've never seen a sexier Elric than Jeff D's Elric. So, but deities and demigods gave the gods hit points and levels and stats, and you have to wonder why. There's that line from Predator: if it bleeds, we can kill it. Well, doesn't that seem... So if Zeus has 400 hit points, 25 stats of 25 across the board, and let's say he's 20th to 36th level and just about everything, that makes Zeus sound pretty powerful. Plus, he has a bunch of other abilities. Pretty good, right, Zeus? But suppose that you've been playing D&D for a few years, your characters, have gone up against dragons and demi-liches, and they have a bunch of badass magic items, and the players are clever, and they want to kill Zeus and take his goddamn lightning bolts. How about that? Just as a trophy. Well, deities and demigods technically made that kind of play possible. And then we saw something similar happen with the adventure that gives us Lolth, Queen of the Demon Web Pits. It's Q1. And again, she's a god, but she's a demon, and she has stats, and therefore you can beat her over the head with a sword until she dies. And I, even as a 12-year-old reading that stuff, I thought to myself, what kind of stats do gods really have? Why give them stats? The heroes of old did not contend with the gods. At most, maybe a demigod or the child of a god or something like that, but not the gods themselves. That is a book that would have been better off with no stats for the gods. No, you can't kill Cthulhu. You can't do it. At least not with bows and arrows and swords, or whatever other weapons you little, um, you little humans have. Just doesn't work. And then if we take a look at the way that D&D and role-playing games in general have expanded, some comments that I've seen, have been, well, that sounds like a great adventure, but it's not made for this system. And I actually think that's whatever the system happens to be. I actually think that's a fair criticism. So let me give it to you from my point of view as a game master. If I'm reading Against the Giants, the classic campaign, guess what? Against the Giants, from first edition AD&D, and I'm playing a 5th edition game. Every time I see the Giants statted out, and keep in mind that in first edition D&D, the stat line was a lot easier. Still, I have to translate that in my head, and it makes for slightly more difficult reading, page by page, every time you do it. If that adventure, now I know this would have been crazy back then, but if somebody created a version of Against the Giants that had no stat blocks, as a game master, I would just fill it in with whatever game I'm using. Whether that's D&D first edition or second or third or 3.5 or Pathfinder or 4th edition or 5th edition or some other game like GURPS Fantasy or any other game or something I've homebrewed myself. When you take out the stats, it makes room for the game master. And this is shown in several products. There are some old school products that don't have stats. Grimtooth's traps didn't have stats. Maybe by the way, Grimtooth's traps, the deadliest, most evil traps ever designed. I'm not sure you should use them, but they're a lot of fun to read. So as you read the description of the huge razor blade that comes out to cut the calf muscle of the unsuspecting adventurer who steps on a booby trap, as that's one of Grimtooth's simple little traps. You can kind of get the idea of why stats in Grimtooth's traps wouldn't make any sense. Because, okay, think of it. Let us assume that your players are cool with traps. They play cautiously, play a little old school, and expect to be challenged that way. And so then you have this variety of traps with acids and monsters, huge ballistas, crazy stuff. And what level do you introduce the trap at? If the trap has, let's say, a difficulty 10 perception to notice it, that indicates it's a pretty low level trap, right? So if the people who wrote Grimtooth's traps put perception DC 10, that's not a hard trap anymore. Perception DC 20, however, that's pretty rough. And now Grimtooth is taking that decision out of your hands. Again, it's true that you can read that DC 10 trap were to exist and say to yourself, It's pretty cool, but I'd like to use it for my players. And yes, it's just a little change to make it DC 20. It's a little change to make the damage different. You know, maybe instead of a poison that does 1d6 damage, you make it a poison that gives the victim exhaustion, because 1d6 damage doesn't mean anything, and 10d6 damage is kind of ridiculous for something on a needle, you know. So you can make your own changes, but again, it's difficult for me. For me, I'd prefer to see no stats written there, and just go from the description of the item to how I think it should run in my game. And so what other gaming products are like that? There's Everway. The Sphere Walker source book for Everway, which has 0 stats. There's Fire on the Velvet Horizon, one of the most amazing monster books I've ever seen. Not exactly table friendly. What you should do as a GM is read it and let it invade your mind. And stats go against that. There's Wayne Barlow's Expedition. What? You got to look that up. Wayne Barlow, Barlowe. Look up his Expedition. It's a sci-fi book. He probably never intended it as a game book, but it has had a lot of influence on movies and video games. You start flipping through it, and you will see that. So, and then there's one more person I'd like to mention before I get on to my own game, and that's H.H. Carlton. There's a reason I have this picture here. H.H. Carlton came to my attention when she hired Journeyman to do this cover that's almost complete and looks awesome, by the way. But when she hired him to do a cover for her, so I took a look at her previous adventure, Veils and Vengeance, and by the way, it's strange calling you HH, Miss Carlton. Or maybe I'll use your handle on Twitch. Not that old lady. I forget. But Veils and Vengeance, I thought was a fun little adventure with a lot of replay value, a lot of role playing, and with all due respect, by the way, you should go out and buy it. It's pay what you want, but I like it. It's fun. It's sweet. There's love and revenge, and sword fights. But as I'm reading it, I'm thinking to myself, this is an adventure that actually doesn't need stats, because it's about the situation, So and so I'm thinking, like, if I have 10th level characters going through this really cool adventure. By the way, one thing she does do is that she sets the level of various characters to like 1 level below your party or 3 levels above your party. So there is an abstraction there, and I just wonder what would happen if Veils and Vengeance had 0 stats, and it makes me think of other products like Fiasco, which creates. Veils and Vengeance has these random tables of ways the adventure could go that remind me of Fiasco, another role-playing game which has, guess what? No stats. It's just role-playing. It's just a situation. And and so I don't know if I don't know if Carlton has read Fiasco, or if she was influenced by something else that was influenced by Fiasco, but the tables reminded me of that. And the cool thing about both Fiasco and the adventures that people typically play with Fiasco and Carlton's Veils and Vengeance is that you can play the same adventure over and over again. In other words, if you wanted to make a campaign out of Veils and Vengeance, you at least a mini campaign, you could. You know, the GM could roll up different situations, change the names, and your characters could essentially be like I don't know, like people who help out, like not exactly matchmakers putting people together, but people making sure that once people are matched that they don't fall apart, something like that. You could have a campaign about like heroes romantically saving other people, other people's relationships. I think that'd be kind of neat. So anyways, we have this survey of these different products, and there's a lot more. Robin Laws wrote a game called Hillfolk, and the first part of that game, in which you set up the relationships, has no stance. Yeah. Okay, so this the second part of that game, which includes rules, has, I don't know, I'd rather use other rules. But the first part of the game, the important part of Hillfolk, which has influenced so many other people, is that it focuses on relationships rather than on stats. And so does this mean that a game shouldn't have stats? Well, no. I play GURPS, and that's a very stat-intensive game. At least the character creation is. And, you know, GURPS marries stats with concept very well. I play D&D 5th edition. I play Vampire. I play lots of games that have stats. But as a game master, I feel very proprietary. I feel like these are my players. These are my NPCs and situations. This is what these stats mean in this game to me. And I don't think that there's a way for a game writer to create stats in such a way that the stat block that you see is the same stat block that I see, because we run our games differently. I'll just give you an example of my own strange interpretation of D&D 5th edition, just to give you an idea. If you were a game writer, how would you write things for me? You know how in D&D, your first level characters are given a task. You guys have to do this, and it always involves saving the world, or the village, or the city, and you kind of wonder, why us? Why are we the ones being called upon to save this stuff? You know, and finally, I feel like D&D 5th edition gives us a good answer. I think the rules in D&D 5th edition, and especially the Player's Handbook, are best interpreted as rules for player characters and NPCs who rival them in power. And the rule that I see that is that powerful is the one that says that you can take a short rest and spend your hit dice and regain your hit points. Also, if you take a long rest, you can regain all your hit points. So here's how I see it. It doesn't work that way for everybody. If it did, like who would die? Well, I get it. You could lose Constitution or something, but you know, What use would there be for clerics if let's say a farmer gets kicked in the head by a mule and his brain is bleeding, but all he has to do is sleep it off? See, I don't think it works that way. I think that the players are special. The players are semi-divine. Sorry, the player characters are semi-divine in some way. They've been touched by the gods or something else, and that's why they heal the way they do. And that's why they're the ones who are sent on that mission. Because if orcs are threatening to destroy your village, perhaps the village has already sent their fourth, their fourth level, badass. But he's an NPC, and he heals slow. He heals like you or I do. So when an orc stabs him, in the kidneys with a spear, and he limps his way back to the village, he's going to be out of commission for months. By the way, I also think the healing from clerics and paladins is slower for ordinary people too. So that's how I run it. So maybe the highly trained guys have already tried it, and now let's try you guys. You might be lower level, but if an orc stabs you in the kidneys with a spear and you survive, you can sleep it off and you'll be fine the next day. You will, I promise. It's what the rules say. Your first level, you've got 10 hit points. You lost 10 hit points from that attack. Sleep it off. You'll be fine. So if that's how I see player characters and certain non-player characters in D&D 5th edition, let's see. If I see monsters as more mythical, etc., maybe more of them have lair actions. Even a humble ogre, if he's got a lair, he gets a lair action. That kind of thing. You can see that I'm different than somebody who runs the game rules as written. I'm different than somebody who wants to run the game where like a long rest is 1 week and a short rest is 1 day, which is something you can do according to the Dungeon Master's Guide. Yeah. So we're all different, and that doesn't include all the other editions. Yeah. So there you go. That is my long way of saying we are not including stats. But if you've made it this far, I am going to include things in the book to make it friendlier to game masters. After all, if I'm writing it with the expectation that essentially you've got to create the stats yourself, here's my descriptions, here's Journey's art, and you fill in the stats yourself depending on the game you're running, and what you want to do with the mask, and what you want to do with the players, and I'm going to make that easier for you. Each mask is going to have a story associated with it, but we're also going to pull out of the story various elements. So for example, in the Mask of the Ghost Demon, I introduce an oracle character, and I'm blanking on her name right now, and I'm sorry. Okay, but that's the kind of thing I would pull out. I'd have a different section in that story of, I'm not sure how many things, a dozen, 2 dozen things that could become elements in your game. Things that you could borrow. So you can be, you can look at the beautiful art and be entertained or inspired by it. You can read what I hope is an interesting story and feel the same way, but I've taken the notes for you, in a sense. I've pulled out everything that could be gameable in that story, and So at the end of that story, after you've read it, you'll be able to add this character or that place or that item into your campaign. It's true that you've got to add the stats yourself, but you know what? I trust you to do that. So, anyways, that's about it for today. You know, one more shout out to to Journey and H. Carlton on the upcoming Whispers of the Sea. I'm looking forward to that adventure also. All right. Good night.